Wait, this is insane. Come on. Oh, come on. Yes! I can't believe this is actually gonna work. Our first moon with Lakitu. All right, and now since we've already noticed weird stuff, maybe, just maybe, I can fish out ground pound moons. I doubt that's the case. I feel like people would know, but I'm willing to try. What? Why? Nobody ever told me. While these features aren't a huge help for Lakitu's total combined score because ground pound moons and seed moons are possible with 2-player, it was cool to see a capture so self-sufficient. I quickly got the 2 other ground pound moons, followed it up with sheep, and traveled into the ruins to get Alcove. It felt nice to move through the kingdom so easily, unlike previous captures, though I can't say fishing the second seed all the way back to town was fun. In the end, I was able to collect every single moon the Mario letters got with the addition of the 2 seed moons and taking notes jump on the palm. What's cool is this was also all possible playing solo, excluding the Jaxi stunt driving moon, which still required 2-player. I headed into Lake Kingdom and grabbed On the Lakeshore solo this time before trying to see if the nearby Taking Notes moon would be possible. I spent a while here, but ultimately determined that it was not happening due to Cappy's restricted movement underwater. I even tried an assist mode, which does increase the duration of the timer, but it still wasn't enough to get every note. In Wooded, I was able to collect the Rabbit Moon, but to my surprise, Lakitu can't hit rock, so that one would have to be saved for later when I went into 2-player mode. I dropped down into Deep Woods, where this time the dinosaur actually worked, unlocking 2 extra moons. At this point, there wasn't anything left in Wooded that I could manage on my own, so I hopped into co-op, collected both the Rolling Rock Moons, and left for Cloud Kingdom. What's fun about this world is Lakitu is going to be the first capture that can make it to Bowser. Using 2-player mode, I can hit the clouds and float up the steps into the arena. However, what's unfortunate is captures aren't programmed to be able to wear Bowser's hat. The only way this fight is going to work on any capture is if there's weird programming to let them damage Bowser, or some exception that lets a specific capture wear the hat. Chances are, nothing in the game except a regular Mario can beat Bowser. Maybe you're thinking I'm wrong because of older videos like Bowser mode, but all those challenges use custom code to make impossible things possible. This challenge, on the other hand, uses none of them. We are viewing every capture in their rawest form, meaning if Nintendo didn't program it, the capture won't be able to do it. But hey, we've seen plenty of weird things already, so there's always a chance something insane happens later. But until then, it's time to take Lakitu into Lost Kingdom. I want you to think about how the letters performed here. Now imagine if they could actually climb up small ledges. That's basically Lost Lakitu. The capture doesn't get stuck in the poison and can actually reach moons like the key at the beginning or the island moon. I collected these along with Under the Bridge before I started exploring the rest of the kingdom. What's really cool about Lakitu and Lost is that because I'm not technically touching the ground, Klepto doesn't trigger anywhere. This perk isn't all that helpful because of some bigger ledges on the road up the level, but I did manage to fish up this checkpoint near the 2D wall. Unfortunately, after warping, I found Lakitu couldn't float far enough to get the nearby moon. Next, I decided moon shards might be possible in 2-player, but once I spawned the moon in, it seemed impossible to reach from the poison. However, to my surprise, Lakitu's fishing pole can just barely touch it. I tried this strategy on a few other unlikely moons, but nothing was working, so I eventually settled on leaving the kingdom and going to Metro. Can Lakitu make the impossible jump? Here we go. You know, it made it closer than I thought it would. 2-player get the checkpoint. Honestly, you might be right. The only checkpoint in Night Metro is the one by the wire. There is not a checkpoint in Main Street right now. So we have to hit that one. I got it! The first capture that could make it to the island with the assistance of 2-player mode. Does this unlock you any moons though? Probably not. But dang, it feels good. Is this really where we lose? Cool to see a capture as unassuming as Lakitu make it to the mainland in Metro Kingdom. but that made it all the more sad to get stuck at the beginning. I did try to see if there was something weird I could do with checkpoints again, but everything was too far to reach, so I left for the next kingdom to find out once and for all, can Lakitu do Snowdram? Yes, actually, he can climb up the wall, but unfortunately we need 2-player mode to get the moon. This isn't a huge deal because when I traveled into Shiveria, I found out Lakitu is too big to enter any sub-areas, so it's not like he's going to be able to get any solo moons regardless. What was surprising though is how close I got to the Shiveria entrance moon. By carefully carving out boxes in 2-player mode, I could build steps for Lakitu that were incredibly close to hitting the moon. This was the absolute highest the strategy could bring Lakitu, which again, painfully close, but I was glad I could at least prove the moon was impossible. Traveling to Seaside, I ran into a lot of moons that you think would be possible, but aren't because one of the ledges you need to climb is just too high. Fortunately, I was still able to fish up what the waves left behind, and even the Notes moon was just barely possible with assist mode. But what I didn't find out until after the stream was that Lakitu as a capture doesn't die in water. Normally this doesn't matter because you just float on it, but if I grab a checkpoint in 2-player and warp, suddenly I have a whole new part of the kingdom to explore. This glitch sounds like a huge buff to Lakitu, but in reality, it only meant 6 extra moons. Underwater Highway, It's a Shortcut, Ocean Trench, Dangerous Ceiling, Nesting Spot, and Northern Reaches. Everything else, like Merci Dori, was too far out of reach. Luncheon Kingdom, I was stuck at the beginning. Ruined, I got the Chest Moon in 2-player. Bowser's, again, stuck at the beginning. And Moon, also nothing. Pretty uneventful end to the run, but Lakitu has set an incredible new high score. 19 moons solo and 31 2-player moons. I definitely underestimated this capture and have no doubt this was probably one of my worst predictions. That being said, I'm excited to see what other unexpected things captures might be able to do going forward. Jizo is the first capture on my list with a proper jump. It's not a good jump, and in retrospect will probably be worse than Lakitu's float, but this is the order I predicted things, so I'm just going to have to deal with it. I started in cap like normal, where I was quickly able to learn how effective the Jizo's jumps are. They're enough to make it up the railing and onto the first step, but can't go any further, even if I try to jump on the boxes. Cascade Kingdom, we again see another capture that can't break the first moon rock. I know the Jizo had a chance to be glitchy, so I spent some time hopping around the rock hoping to clip inside. The worst part about that clip is that one wouldn't have even helped me. So yeah, I could clip into the floor but not the rock, meaning the moon was likely impossible. Par for the course in Cascade, so time to move on to sand. I immediately went for the seed moons, quickly discovering that even with the hop, Jizo is too short to collect them. This wasn't too surprising, but it definitely was disappointing given just how close I could get. After, I left town and headed up towards the dunes to test my next idea. I think he might ground pound stuff. Yup. So that's good. That really only helps the 1-player score over the 2-player though. At the time, I didn't realize how accurate of a statement this was, but as I played through the kingdom, I learned the Jizo collected the exact same moons as the Moai, but entirely on its own, and gets nothing extra from 2-player. The Snatchu does get incredibly close to an extra moon in the Jaxi driving sub-area, but falls short on account of its mediocre jump. There was also a weird instance where I managed to randomly clip through the floor. Get another seed and jump up that one. The seed doesn't make you jump higher. What just happened? No! This could hint at the employees only moon being possible, but after 20 minutes of bouncing into a wall trying to replicate the clip, I decided it wasn't worth the time and would be okay if somebody else came and proved it in the future. While I'm trying to get as many moons as humanly possible, I understand this game has weird random things I will miss. I do want my final scores to be accurate, but it'd be narcissistic to think I'm going to find and prove 100% of everything, especially when random clips like this exist. I'll do my best to mention any close moons like this going forward, in case anyone wants a starting point for their own research. For now though, let's continue the run into Lake where I got the Ground Pound Moon, and Wooded where I couldn't reach Deep Woods, but could still get the Rockin' Rabbit. It wasn't until Lost where things got particularly interesting because that Poison Walking trait helped this capture get the Key Moon, the island, and Under the Bridge. Those 3 moons would be the last the Jizo statue collected. This isn't surprising given how similar this capture's performance was to things like the letters, but it's still disappointing to find out I was wrong about how useful the small jump would be. I might be able to make this actually. No, that wasn't even close. At least, that's if we're only talking about 2-player, because of the 13 moons the statue collected, all were done in single player thanks to the jump, making it the only capture so far not to be buffed by co-op. Heck, this will probably be the only capture in the whole challenge to hold that accolade. It's just sad that 13 is such a weak score. Also, no, it couldn't do Snowdram. Originally, I wasn't gonna test this guy, but when I started these streams, him and Bonsai Bill were the only exclusions that felt controversial. My original reasoning being that the short timer meant you had an incredibly limited run to do anything before an uncapture, creating a very weird gameplay loop with the rules I set. But in retrospect, that's what makes the capture interesting, so here we are. My prediction for this one is a bit more random because I put it in after already testing a few captures. Like, I would have loved to rank it lower, but I think it'd be unfair to rank something new under anything I already finished. Ultimately, I don't know if that would have been correct, but that's what we're here to find out. How far can the Bullet Bill make it in Cap Kingdom? Wow, the worst one yet. In spite of this capture being so predictably garbage for the challenge, it seems like in Cascade, there's an actual chance I'll be able to collect the first moon. I can pretty easily fly over to the rock and break it, but the problem is I am now no longer the Bullet Bill capture and have to reload to my last checkpoint. Fortunately, the story progress saved, so if the Bullet Bill is tall enough, the moon should be possible. I think... That's so sad. I feel like a lot of people would just quit here, but I am so close, and given the ground does have some small slopes, I think there's a chance I can make this work. All right, let's break the rock first. Rewarp. Come on. We got it! That was awesome. Maybe the low expectations for the Bullet Bill were misguided. I mean, being the first capture to collect the first moon is a cool accomplishment, even if it's the only one it can get in the kingdom. Sand as a whole ended up being a lot more disappointing and brought me back to reality on how bad of a capture the Bullet Bill is for this challenge. The only thing I can do is use 2-player mode to hit the checkpoint in town. Everything else is either too far away or not the right height. I left pretty quickly, but later had the insane realization that the seed moon might be possible. I eventually hit the seed into the pot with my own explosion, which I decided should count, and after that, it was actually pretty easy to gain the height I needed to collect it. Lake Kingdom was pretty normal, only being able to collect the classic Ground Pound moon. This was followed by Wooded, where the only possible moon was Hoppin'. I continued on with the game, where my expectations were again confirmed, with nothing being possible until Seaside. I started at the Odyssey, where I was able to fly over to the Beach House checkpoint, giving me a new spawn once I exploded. From there, I went for the Notes moon, and to my surprise, I was just barely low enough to collect the notes while still being high enough to get the moon once it spawned. From there, I warped back to the Odyssey, flew over to the Rolling Canyon checkpoint, and used 2-player mode to get a second moon. Oh, come on. Yes! Oh my god. I did it! 2 moons! The rest of the run, like normal, was pretty uneventful. Sure, most captures fail because of how unforgiving the late game is, but when you only have several seconds to do anything, that doesn't make it any easier. The Bullet Bill ended the run with 3 moons solo and 6 moons in 2-player. While the Bonsai Bill does have a much bigger body, which could be annoying for certain moons, it should vastly outperform the Bullet Bill because of how much longer it survives before exploding. I don't know how many moons this will end up translating to, especially given how much 2-players seem to mix things up for the Bullet Bill. Either way, this is definitely going to be an interesting run, even if it'll probably be a bit painful. All right, how far can a Bonsai Bill get? Whoa, we're gonna be the first one to make it to the door? That's awesome. Reaching the door itself isn't useful if you can't fit inside without uncapturing, but it was neat to see what was technically a new high score for the kingdom. I continued into Cascade, where I was able to explode the rock, respawn, and clunk the first moon, just like I did with the Bullet Bill. I spent some extra time trying to fly around the kingdom looking for a checkpoint I could maybe grab, but even if I respawned at the first moon, it wasn't enough to get me anywhere, so I headed into Sand Kingdom. The first moon I wanted to try and get was the
created another demon to wreak havoc on the world. At the same time, we see the suffering that people around Gary are undergoing. Timmy's mother specifically seemingly losing her son to this elevator friend. And then at someone's convincing, either a demon or most likely Gary, she is told that with enough flesh and with enough bodies, she can have her boy back. So then we see what Timmy's mother created, this horrific abomination, this giant figure of worship almost, made out of blood, abomination boy Gary. She is told that with enough flesh and with enough bodies, she can have her boy back. So then we see what Timmy's mother created, this horrific abomination, this giant figure of worship almost, made out of blood and guts. And despite all the bodies in the room, she leaves in that note that she only needs a few more. Now, we don't know exactly what happened to Timmy's mom. She was possibly killed by one of the demons. Maybe when Alu came forward out of the ground, it killed her. Or she probably died at some point. I mean, there's so much blood and carnage around the apartment complex, just take your pick. But I like to think, with exercising that statue and seeing the figure of Timmy blink away, that we release Timmy's soul from the shadow realm with the elevator friend that we know he went to. There's also the chance near the end of the apartment section that while moving from one room to the other, John can spot the elevator friend and Timmy walking down the hallway. So again, John can spot the elevator friend and Timmy walking down the hallway. So again, perhaps with exorcising him, we have released his soul into the afterlife. So this is just a microcosm of the destruction Gary is causing, and some of his more faithful acolytes. But now, with Lisa saved, John can return home. And since we also defeated Tiffany, we see another third of that sigil we saw at the end of chapter 1 disappear. With that, day 2 is over, and John returns home to continue his dream. The dream picks up where we left it last time. John is in the basement now holding Father Allred's cross and goes to find Amy. He walks through the house, although the house seems to be empty. In fact, the only evidence he can find of anyone being there is Bob's glasses. John goes looking for Amy and her parents, moving from room to room calling out their names, before eventually he finds himself upstairs. One thing of note is that whenever John tries to enter the twins' room, despite us being able to enter the bedroom perfectly fine in chapter 1 set in 1987, here in 1986, when John tries to enter the twins' room, it says that he can't remember anything past that. Now, this is likely just because John didn't enter the twins' room in 1986 during the initial exorcism, but still something interesting to note. John continues on, eventually making his way to the attic, and then upon walking to the back of the attic, he finds Amy.
You're here at rest. Amy, let's go back to the basement. You're supposed to here. Let's go. You need to get better. What about Gary? It keeps better. You shouldn't save her. You that's enough. She's here with me. You know, we are going to sit here and now. I'll buy yourself. Here and now. I'll buy yourself. Except me. Father Allred, nobody.
Now, we're not told here explicitly who Meredith is, but if you remember John's recounting of this event all the way back in chapter 1, he says that the demon used his mother's name. So here, the demon is mocking John for the death of his mother, remarking that he wasn't able to save her. Why does he think he could save Amy? We awake, and the day is October the 30th, one day until the Profane Sabbath. Also, if you haven't already noticed, the Profane Sabbath is on Halloween, October 31st. I mean, if you're going to make a horror game that has to do with demon rituals and summoning dates, why not make it Halloween? For funsies. John gets out of bed, walks past the doorway covered in crosses, and makes his way to the front door, where there is again another letter from Father Garcia.
John, I'm getting reports of children exhibiting strange behavior at the daycare center on 4th Street. If Nate and Jason are there, then you can bet that it's the place they will try to summon Malthus. There's no time left. Go to the daycare and find out what's really going on. Fear not. Vaya con Dios, Father Garcia.
Again, Garcia is continuing his hunt for the last surviving members of the Martin family, and again trying to stop the cult from whatever's happening at the daycare. The mention about they will try to summon Malthus is interesting. I mean, it can be assumed that John wasn't able to get the information to Garcia yesterday because, again, the events of the apartment building did happen yesterday, but as we saw there, Malthus has been well, good, and summoned. But again, Garcia probably doesn't know that, which is why he's still trying to prevent his manifestation. But still, if the cult's trying to do something at a daycare and they've got 1 demon summoning under their belt, 2 counting Tiffany, they should probably stop him for whatever's going on. So John leaves his house to get in his car and travel to the daycare. Again, you can check out the houses around you to see things progressively getting worse, but we already talked about that, and the story's really getting good. So for now, we travel to the daycare. Before John gets to the daycare, a cop car rushes by him. John, making the call that something may be going on, decides to park just before the daycare and then walk to it. This seems to be the right call, as when he gets to the front of the daycare, it is surrounded by police, all of which have their guns aimed, ready to shoot anyone who steps out. Now this is interesting and also makes sense. The cult has been doing more and more overt activities in the past several months. While sure, back during the time of Miriam Bell and even the events of Chapter 1, they were a bit more subtle, residing themselves in the shadows. If the events of Chapter 2 that John witnessed in his dream are occurring around this time, then they straight up murdered an entire SWAT team down in the sewers. And then back at the clinic, sure, the only cop that saw a demon with his own eyes was killed shortly thereafter. That's still a cop that got murdered in broad daylight. Those things tend to cause some investigation. And I mean, come on, we saw the body count that they were getting up to in the apartments. There's no way the police wouldn't notice. And sure enough, it seems they have, as there's dozens of cops who have seemingly cornered Gary. Now, it seems that the cult doesn't really care about this, because their plan is to just outrun any resistance they run into. Because at this point they have so much manpower and so much power, and it's just one day till the profane Sabbath, so if they can hold out for 24 hours and enact whatever ritual they're trying to enact, then they're home free. Because, you know, what are bullets going to do against the devil? Which it is an interesting point that bullets do seem to have some effect on creatures in this series. Like, there's the cop in the clinic who shoots the demon to death as John holds his cross up to it. And I think what's happening there is it's possible to kill the physical form these things take on, but not the actual demon, or banish the actual demon back to hell that John's exorcisms do. So effectively, guns slow them down or stop the form that they're in, but John's cross is the one that actually kills them. Anyway, because of the police, we can't get in through the front door, so John has to find a way around back. While walking into the back of the daycare, John finds another note from Gary.
A riddle, priest. How do you make a portal to hell? Come and see me, and I'll show you.
Walking inside of the daycare, one of the first things we'll notice is what appears to be several dead children around some kind of doorway. Now, it's possible that these dead people are thralls, considering they're painted red, but also considering that it's a daycare, and we've seen in notes previously that children, or at least the young, can be suckered into what the cult is doing. There's a solid chance that these kids were used to shut off this doorway or cause some kind of ritual. Walking through the daycare, we can find various drawings made by young children decorated around the walls. Several of them containing red figures or cult members in robes, or depictions of demons following children and their families. In the same room with the dead bodies, we can find a note, and this one is in the purple color of Amy's writings.
Mother Moon watcheth her little ones behind a door of sleep. Daughter Chalice is filled, an offering to the Master in the unseen world. Spirit bird arriveth from afar and cometh back to roost. These vessels are the unholy Trinity. The fallen star shall guide them. What colors can you see? Look to the children if you are lost.
Now this note is interesting for a lot of reasons. For one, it's about to be the answer to the puzzle as to how to get to Gary and the rest of the cult. But there's also a healthy amount of symbolism here. So we know that in Christianity, the Trinity is the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. These three make up the Holy Trinity. The unholy Trinity, as explained here in this note, is composed of the Mother, the Daughter, and the Spirit. The Mother we can assume to be Miriam Bell. She kicked off the occult practices, she began all of the rituals, and seems to be the one who started this entire dive into turmoil. Specifically, the note says, Mother Moon watcheth her little ones behind a door of sleep. And in John's dream about the Snake Meadow Hill Church, Miriam specifically refers to him and the children as her little ones. The daughter we can assume to be Tiffany. It says that her chalice is filled as an offering to the unseen world. Well, for one, Tiffany explicitly referred to herself as the daughter of the unspeakable, and since whatever ritual she did required 490 souls, we can assume that her chalice was filled. And it even mentions the unseen world, the place that Tiffany explicitly says she goes to, and we can only go to after playing the elevator game. And then there's the mention of the spirit bird arriving from far off. Now, you may be led to believe that that means Gary, but I don't think so. Instead, I think the spirit bird is referring to Malphas. For one, Malphas's appearance is very bird-like. He seems to be some kind of demonic crow. And the idea of him arriving now and coming to roost kind of implies the ritual they were performing to bring him into this world. I think Gary is the one that's mentioned right afterwards when it says, the fallen star shall guide them. At the beginning of the game, when you boot it up and get the message, Gary loves you, over and over, we see a verse from Revelations 9, verse 1. The verse is, Then the fifth angel sounded, and I saw a star fallen from heaven to the earth. To him was given the key to the bottomless pit. This verse is in reference to the final trumpet sounding during the rapture, or time of Revelations, or Judgment Day, or it depends on your, interpretation of Revelations, but we're not getting into that in this video. The takeaway is that it has something to do with the end times, and specifically a fallen star who has the key to the bottomless pit. Given that this message when we boot up the game is immediately followed by Gary loves you, I believe this fallen star is Gary. As not only does Gary match this description of the fallen star, but he also seems to be leading everyone else on a path to damnation. Anyway, using the hints about the chalice and the star and what have you from the poem, we can go to the different kids' drawings around the room, look at their images of the bird, of the chalice and whatnot, and then exercise each of those items in the daycare until they turn the correct color, allowing us to open the doorway and walk down to the catacombs. As we walk down into the catacombs, which I will from here on out be referring to as Garyland, because that's what it's called in the game files, we find our first note.
If you're reading this, then congratulations. You are on your way to experiencing the wonders of our unspeakable future under the guidance of Gary. Gary, our brother. Gary, our friend. Gary, a normal human being just like you and me. As a Tier 1 Acolyte, you are just beginning your unspeakable journey to eventually see what Gary sees, and prove yourself worthy to be a vessel fit to experience the second death, reserved for only the most worthy. To find out if you are a vessel, remember to attend meetings of the Eternal Order of the Second Death twice a week. Follow Gary's instructions exactly. Be honest with him in all that you do. Do not ever ask what is behind the door in the basement of the clinic.
So this seems to be a note given to cult members who are just beginning their journey into Gary's cult. Further evidence that Gary is not a human because they keep feeling the need to emphasize that for some reason. And also, the mention at the end, don't ask about what's behind the basement door at the clinic, doesn't mean a lot to us because we did the side quest to get into the basement door and fight the mother demon lady thing. But if you hadn't done that, because remember all that's optional, then this note would probably turn your head about that. But we're cool, so we're moving on. We continue down the stairs and find another note, this one from Gary himself.
She consumed 6 little twigs. Only 2 were left. To walk as husks. Go ahead, priest. Stare into the eyes of my mother.
Now, that part about she consumed 6 little twigs and 2 were left to walk as husks. 4 and 2. This is definitely in reference to the 6 children that went missing in the 50s when Belle ran the orphanage. Now, some of you probably heard about the twins who survived all the way back then and heard me talk about twins a lot in Chapter 2 and thought, oh, well, the twins must mean Nate and Jason, right? However, that timeline doesn't make sense because the current year is 1987 and Nate and Jason are, 6 or 7 years old? And this event with Miriam Bell was back in the 50s, so the twins would be grown up by now. Regardless, Gary then tells us to stare into the eyes of his mother. If we walk to the painting in front of us, we can see a painting of Miriam Bell, similar to depictions of her that were seen in Chapter 2. The longer we stare at this painting, the more stretched and grotesque it becomes, until eventually she degrades into a demonic, disgusting form, which opens a doorway and allows us to walk through. Now this is interesting. Gary refers to Miriam as his mother. Of course, Gary isn't human, or at least not a normal human. So is Miriam literally his mother, or is this more of a symbolic gesture? We'll find out soon. We come across 2 statues that a note tells us is dedicated by the Save family, the same family who had the tomb back in Chapter 2. And just like the tomb in Chapter 2, we can use these 2 statues as a save state. Anytime we walk past them, it will save our game's progress. After exercising one of these statues, we get our note for Tier 2 acolytes.
If you are reading this, congratulations! You have officially been granted Tier 2 status in the Eternal Order of the Second Death. Upon crossing the threshold from Tier 1 into Tier 2, your life as an acolyte will change dramatically. You may start noticing shadowy figures in the corners of rooms or experience feelings of lost time while holding sharp objects. Ancient symbols written in blood will materialize on the floor and walls of your home. Animals will no longer trust you. You may emit a foul odor that will cause your former loved ones to avoid you. These are just a few of the marvelous blessings that await you in this new stage of life. If you remain loyal to Gary, your journey towards becoming a vessel for the Second Death will progress to new levels of knowledge and power. Remember, if you neglect your weekly meetings or do not pay your tithes to the Order, your fingers will be forcibly bent backwards. Gary loves you.
So the cult, with a little bit of threatening, is continuing to emphasize the purpose of this cult. It seems that their penultimate goal is to become something known as a vessel for the Second Death. Now, we're not sure exactly what the Second Death is yet, but we can put some pieces together. We saw ritual masks and we saw a dagger back in the apartments. We've seen several instances at this point of people or depictions of people with their face cut out, and we saw that Tiffany tried to do the ritual herself and her head effectively exploded. So for some reason, this ritual entails people putting a mask on their face, having their face carved out like a pumpkin for who knows what reason. Actually, I know what reason. You don't know what reason, but you will soon, and then we'll both know what reason. We continue on a bit further and find what appears to be a sort of chessboard. When we walk into the next room, we can see that the different faces of the chessboard correlate to different movements. So for example, if we exercise one of the faces, it will cause the chairs to mirror. If we exercise another, it will cause them to rotate, etc. And I'll go ahead and tell you now, this puzzle is literally impossible. You're not supposed to solve it, you're just supposed to go back and forth trying to solve it for some time. Eventually, while walking into the room with the faces, a man will jump out from behind a statue and stab John, injecting him with something, causing this to happen. John has a series of visions, different images of the sun, birds, nature. The majority of the images we see in this scene correlate to the song King of Pain by The Police. Erdorf envisions the song as a sort of theme song for John and what he's going through. So for the most part, the images we see are an artistic representation of John's state of mind. However, some of these images aren't a reference to the song. Some of them depict things like the Snake Meadow Hill Church and John and Lisa holding hands. As a matter of fact, John and Lisa are together with the 4 other children from the Snake Meadow Hill Church, with Miriam Bell somberly watching over them. Remember how back in the prologue, or the alternate ending prologue for chapter 2, despite the fact that 12 children in total were killed by Miriam's influence, only 11 showed up while John was on fire. But if you'll remember, Gary's poem said that 2 of those 12 kids were left to walk as husks, and that is because of the 12 children involved in the killings at the Snake Meadow Hill Church, and of the only 2 survivors, 1 was Lisa, and 1 was John Ward. John was one of the children raised in that orphanage by Miriam Bell, meaning that John was one of the children that sang songs with Miriam and nearly gave himself up to the demons that inhabited her. For one, this explains why John and Lisa had such a close connection, and why when Lisa was in trouble, John was the first person she called to. They're twins. And why it's so tragic if you allow John to become possessed and kill her during the fight at the apartments. But the real question this raises is if John even has a chance with any of this. Because think about it, John was one of the children who from a young age was susceptible to Miriam's doing. The investigator mentions when talking to the 2 remaining twins, which we now know to be John and Lisa, that John and Lisa were confused why the investigator didn't ask Miriam Bell herself, because she's right there. And that whole thing culminated with the 2 of them being dragged to the basement by Belle in her demonic state. Who knows what she did to them? Perhaps John has always been poised to take over this cult or become one of its high members from the very start. No wonder after chapter 2 his cross goes from silver to bronze. You were once posed to be the subjugation and second in command of a demon, of Miriam Bell, the mother of demons, and you've become a priest. You have gone as far as you can in the opposite direction, only to now realize it didn't matter. That Miriam Bell, that thing that you unwillingly set into motion all those years ago, that is the very chain of events that led to the death of Amy Martin. John has been fighting so fiercely and so strongly for 30 years to change what he's supposed to be, but nevertheless, people are still getting hurt. As far as that injection that John was injected with in the first place, that's the injection that we heard referenced in the clinic. We know that the pills are supposed to make you see hallucinations of something, to prepare your mind and body for demonic possession or the second death ritual. And the injectable version is just the stronger form of it. So when John was injected with this, all of these visions were to prepare him mentally for his place as a ruler or as a subject to demons. And once this entire slideshow of images is over, we simply see the message, now you're ready. So we see the dire straits that John is in now, that his entire life has just been a very long stepping stone to the point that he becomes subject to Gary's demonic takeover, as if the entire game was planned from the start. But before we pick up with John back in the underground catacombs of Garyland, while he is in this state of mind, we continue his dream from 1986. After Amy approached him in the attic, seemingly John ran out and barricaded the doorway, scared for his life. If John decides to not make a sprint for the exit and instead investigate the house, he will find Bob and Cindy's body choked to death with their own intestines. This is the redacted parts of the letter that John wrote to Molly all the way back in chapter 1. It seems that Amy, after disabling Father Alred and distracting John, the demon within her murdered her parents in the most brutal way imaginable. John, scared for his life, tries to get out the door. But before he leaves, he remembers Father Alred. There's actually two ways this dream sequence can end. If, while playing as John, you decide to sprint for the exit, this cutscene will play out. And while this isn't the canon series of events, if you instead go to the basement to try to retrieve Father Alred, who last you saw was lying on the floor, this cutscene will play out.
It's going to be alright, Father Alred. It's going to be alright, Father Alred.
At that moment, John is more afraid than he ever has been. Amy has murdered 3 see how that in the household, and it seems is about to murder John as well. But before we can see how that night of September the 21st, 1986 ended, John wakes back up in Garyland. So, waking up after he underwent that hallucination, John walks into the next room to find it is a bloodbath. There are bodies everywhere, stuck to the wall, sprawled out across the floor. One surviving cult member crawls away, and as John gets close, begs for mercy. It seems that when John was injected with this drug, he went berserk. It makes sense too. Part of the corruption needed to cause someone to either be possessed or be a part of the ritual would be to give in to their sinful pleasures or sinful desires. And John throughout the entire games has been portrayed as very meek and polite and quiet, perhaps too much so. So when given a drug to let his inhibitions fly and do whatever he wants, John slaughtered everyone. And to clarify, these aren't demons, these aren't ghosts that he killed, these are thralls, these are cult members, people that can bleed. Something deep in John despises this cult, obviously for the actions they did, but also most likely because of his place in it all, because of the root he has in its foundations. Moving forward through Garyland, we find another save statue. Like the last one, we can exercise it to receive another note.
Filthy acolyte. The substance of Gary's influence flows through your veins. You are corrupted beyond repair. Your family and friends have forsaken you. There is no returning from the path you have chosen. Only Gary can save you now. Give up and fully let him into your heart and mind. If you do so, he will make you into a vessel worthy of the unspeakable. Resist, and your soul will be lost forever. Welcome to Tier 3.
While walking through this area, we'll come across a statue of Moloch. Moloch, a figure known for sacrifices, demands that we offer him 3 in order to reach the underground of Garyland. We can tackle these 3 offerings in any order we choose. One requires a game of red light, green light against a statue. Another requires us to step past some cultists and get it out of a room to the far left, but on our way back, the cultists have begun to transform. It seems that the devout cult members or high-ranking cult members have had their bodies transform into whatever these giant pink tendril things is. To evade them, you just have to wait for them to throw their attack and then navigate it, as it takes them a long time to reset. But of course, and as always, if John is touched by anything, he dies. The last piece of the offering we have to find is at the top of the map, where we see that the offering is on the other side of a mirror. When we get close to the mirror demon from chapter 1 and 2 appears again. In this case, we're not in the mirror realm, but we have to fight it with our reflection that is in the mirror realm. After defeating him, we can pick up the offering and move on. This also makes the mirror demon the only demon to appear in all 3 chapters of Faith. Just fun note. Again, as we're navigating this underground area, more cultists will spawn in and attack us. But before we go to give the offerings to the statue, we can complete the final step to unlocking the end game. As you're walking through this area, you'll probably notice that there are 2 paintings down these long hallways. One is a depiction of a nun on stage. and the other is the depiction of a nun in front of a church. Of course, we can believe the nun to be Miriam Bell and the church to be Snake Meadow Hill Church. Every time that you pass through this area, each painting will become more and more corrupted, with Miriam's body on stage slowly transforming and becoming a monster similar to the unspeakable, and Miriam's wicked face slowly turning to face us. After these paintings are taken to their full conclusion, this giant floating head will appear and begin attacking John. The spirit is often referred to by the community as the unholy spirit. That's because, again, we have the mother, and we have the daughter, as mentioned earlier, and now we have the unholy spirit, the full perversion of the Holy Trinity. This floating head will move slowly towards John, and he's pretty easy to fight because all you've got to do is move just off screen and he'll restart his cycle. So you can just do damage and go back and forth between two areas, and he's pretty easy to defeat. However, if the floating head makes contact with John for the first time in the game, John doesn't immediately die. Instead, he is teleported to his time at the Yale Psychiatric Hospital. He's in a straitjacket in a padded room with crosses adorning the walls. The objective in this cutscene, since John can no longer use his cross, is to get away from the floating head before it can catch him. If John can get all the way to the end of the hallway, he will then appear back in Garyland, and the boss fight will continue from there. There's no limit to how many times this can happen, but every time that it does happen, the head will move a bit faster. So inevitably, the cutscene becomes impossible at some point. But this is interesting. It gives us insight to John's time at that psych ward, the thing that we've heard hinted about in various letters. And from what little we do see, his time there was not great. After defeating this giant floating head, finally, all three parts of the seal will be broken. We're not sure exactly what this means now, but all you need to know is after defeating the floating head, after defeating Tiffany, and after defeating the mother thing down in the basement, we have unlocked the true endgame for Chapter 3. So congratulations. Because we've now done all three parts, I also want to mention that letter that seems to be written by Amy that we found in the daycare, how I said that's in reference to Miriam Bell Malthus and Tiffany. It could also be just in reference to the mother down in the clinic, Tiffany, and the spirit could be this unholy spirit, this thing that was floating towards us. I think personally that the interpretation works both ways, that it is representing the three baddies of the series that we've encountered so far, and again the star being Gary, and that it also represents the 3 steps needed to unlock the endgame of Chapter 3. Going back to the statue of Moloch and giving it the offerings, we can now pass through its stomach into the underground, or the even further underground. Down here we find our final note for the cult acolytes.
You are now a Tier 4 acolyte. You have descended beyond anything that could possibly save you. Your words are not your own. Your actions are not your own. You belong, body and spirit, to Gary. Your face itches for the warm embrace of the ritual mask. You long for the blinding pain of the knife. You truly are Gary's chosen vessel. Fear not, only a little longer, and you will experience the second death. Adios, Alma Perdita. Gary loves you.
Anyone who's reading this note is beyond saving. And again, the fact that the cult doesn't only do the horrible things that they do, but they relish in it and love it, pushes to their evil just a little bit more. We also find another interesting note down here.
Master of spirits, the body of the mother stayeth suspended beneath the crucible of the profane Sabbath. If thou canst unlock the final secret of the crucible, know ye this. The cross hath the power to weaken the mother, but only someone who is ablaze with purifying fire canst truly destroy her. If thou canst understand these words, thou shalt know the true cost of thy faith.
Keep this note in mind for later. We then enter a series of long, dark hallways. Eventually, at the end of it, we find a lantern. Walking with the lantern, we get jump scared by a bird, which, thanks Erdorf, appreciate it. Definitely didn't scream first time I played this. And we catch quick glimpses of people watching us through the windows or grates or whatever these panels are. Eventually, another noise startles us to reveal a near headless person walking backwards, with what appears to be a mask of Malthus on their face. These are vessels or worshippers of Malthus, who, as we can see, have fully gave their body to the demon. We have to run from these things as we use our lantern to navigate out of these underground tunnels. Eventually, we come out of the tunnels and find ourselves, once again, as if there wasn't enough of these in this series, a dark forest. In the center area of this forest, we have a large doorway that is covered by a large seal. We have to venture off the beaten path with our lantern to find the 3 vessels that are keeping this seal intact. After running into each of these vessels, we have to exorcise them, and after all 3 are exorcised, the door will be opened. I absolutely despise this segment because the lantern isn't like a big enough glow to see where things are coming from, so because of that, kind of just got to figure it out. So you have to move without moving too quick to run into them, and they can spawn in really tricky places where it's hard to get away, and yeah, not a fan. And to clarify, I don't mean not a fan in a bad way, I mean not in a fan in that it's purposefully difficult game design, and I died a lot. One Easter egg that we can find while walking through this dark forest is Gary's cabin. In it, we can find a letter to someone named Jacob.
My dearest colleague Jacob, thank you for your letter. I am delighted to hear of the success of your venture in Pennsylvania. However, it was not enough to persuade me to join your cause. I have no interest in crumbling ghost towns, nor government experiments, nor gibbering behemoths that lurk shamefully in the darkness between worlds. Such matters are not worthy of my expertise. My methods may be more delicate than yours, but I assure you, they were given to me straight from the source. The Antichrist will seep forth very soon. The second death will consume this world. This pitiful, fleshy sphere, still in its infancy, yet everlastingly too late to redeem. When the time comes, I hope that we may reunite as cohort, albeit not equals. Love always, Gary. P.S. I almost forgot to thank you for the pet. I will keep it outside my private quarters as a guard against intruders.
This note and the picture accompanying it are a reference to another game developed by New Blood, the same studio that developed Faith, a game called Dusk. It's funny because in the letter, Gary is telling another cult leader that Gary himself is too important for that other cult's cult activities. Gary even remarks that Jacob has sent him a quote-unquote pet, and Gary says he'll keep it to watch the cabin. Sure enough, upon leaving the cabin, this pet attacks, and we have to exorcise it. This creature is a monster, again, from the game Dusk. In the picture accompanying the note, we can see Gary standing with Jacob and another villain from one of New Blood's upcoming titles. This is really the only part of the entire series that is an altogether Easter egg. Like, there's other cool clues we can find that will somehow relate back to the story, but this one's just for fun and fans of New Blood. After we exorcise all 3 of the vessels, we can head back to the doorway at the center of the forest. When we walk up to the door, we'll be asked if we really want to open it. After John says yes, he steps in to find himself in a dark corridor full of thralls. As John walks through the corridor, Gary once again asks the question, how do you make a portal to hell? John continues to walk, the thralls becoming more infected, more consumed with this demonic force. Gary continues and says, sometimes it waits for the one who has already walked through it. John continues through transformed demons. Gary says sometimes it opens itself in the deepest, darkest room where nobody can find it, before finally stating, sometimes it walks right up to you. John steps forward through the darkness and sees finally Nate and Jason. After all this time, after all this suffering, he's made it to them. But as John stands there bloodied and battered, he hears something behind him and turns. And turns. But as John Jason, after hello John Hood, this is Gary Miller. Which means it was also Gary Miller who injected us after the chess puzzle earlier. And now, decades of planning that began all the way back with Miriam Bell are finally coming to fruition as John stands in front of Gary. And now, in this moment, for the last time, we have a flashback to what happened on the night of September the 21st, 1986. After John ran to the basement and found Father Alred dead on the floor, in fear, he called out to God, before then asking anybody to help him. A figure of light appears in front of him, and Gary begs this figure to free him from this, to get him out of this situation. The figure clarifies and says that if John leaves now, Amy will be damned forever. John is the only one who can possibly save this girl before the cult entirely has their hooks in her. But John is so afraid, and he thinks he is so worthless to defeat this creature, that in this moment he makes a deal with whatever creature this is trying to save him, that he will swear off Amy's soul if he's allowed to leave.
I swear it. I swear it.
And at this, John is allowed to leave the house just as the police arrive. And now we see a bit more of what is pushing all this guilt John has on his head. The reason that after spending so much time in the psychiatric hospital, after spending time with a woman he loved, Molly, despite all of that, he had to go back to that house. And the reason he had to go back is Amy Martin's death is on his hands. Did John want to be at the front line of this? Did he choose to be the only person who could save Amy Martin? Of course not. But it didn't change the fact that in that moment, he had the capability to save her. He had the capability to perform the exorcism, and he didn't do it. And from there, the cult had a year to do whatever they wanted to Amy. And by the time we see her in 1987, her face is gone, the second death ritual has been performed, and her soul's definitely lost forever. And every bit of that weight falls on John's shoulders. That's the reason in 1987 he ventured out into the woods at night to go back to the Martin household to try to make a difference. John has traveled for years and years to try to overcome the evil that he knew from Miriam Bell. And then in 1986, when a young girl needed him most, he got scared, he ran away. And he was so desperate to do so that he made a deal with the devil. A lot of people think that it is God himself appearing here in this vision John had back in the Martin house. And of course, that's what the figure wants to appear as. That's why he cloaks himself in white and speaks with a holy voice. But the idea of this being God never set right to me. For one, why would God want to make a deal that would condemn Amy to the demons? And also, the way that the voice speaks and says, swear it, in like a demanding voice, like I want to hear you say that this girl is left to the demons. I always suspected this, and during my interview with Erdorf, we confirmed that this is in fact Satan. Not a demon, not Malthus, not a high-ranking member of Satan's party. This is the devil himself. His appearance here being a reference to 2 Corinthians chapter 11 verse 14 when it says, "And no marvel, for Satan himself is transformed into an angel of light." Throughout the entirety of Faith the Unholy Trinity, and really in the real world, but again, topic for another video, every trick, everything that the devil has at his disposal is just a bastardized version of what God had already set up. What's the symbol of the demons or demonology? Just take the cross and flip it upside down. What's the symbol to some of them? Oh, well, take a star, symbol of God, of the virgin birth and whatnot, and just flip that upside down. What are they called? Their group of 3 leaders. That's a play on the Holy Trinity, the Unholy Trinity. Everything that they have is just a lesser version of what God has already put in place. As a matter of fact, the devil himself is an angel that fell from grace. He is nothing more than a creation of what God has made, and because of that, his symbols are nothing more than a reimagining of what has already been. There's nothing that the devil can manipulate that God did not make. And we see that here in Satan's appearance, he is pretending to be the God, to be the one over all. But the only way that Satan knows to do that is to simply put on the clothes of God, but then speak as himself. To be biting and gnashing, to say swear it, to say that he wants the girl's soul forever. And of course, this all begs the question, In the world of faith, the unholy trinity, if sure this being of light that we see is actually the devil, then where is God in all of this? We'll talk about that in just a minute, but first, let's see where John's at. After we have this final vision that tells us of John's cowardice, John awakes to see that he is sitting in front of Gary Miller. We are also informed that night is past and it is now the day of the profane Sabbath. Gary sits before us, and I love how unimposing his figure is. He seems to just be an older, balding man with glasses. We know that he has charisma to lead all of these people to the life of evil and debauchery that they've led, but physically, he's just a guy, a normal human being, just like you and me. Gary, of course, has taken a liking to John, considering that Miriam Bell is the reason all of this began in the first place, and at one point John was important to her. So as a sort of favor, Gary says that he will answer 3 questions from John. Now there are a total of 6 questions that can be asked, but again, we're only allowed to ask 3 of them. Or you could do what I did and play through the game multiple times and figure out the answers to all of them, which we'll go over right now. Of the 3 questions you can ask about the injection, you can ask about Gary himself, you can ask about Malthus, you can ask about the boys, Nate and Jason, you can ask about Amy, and you can ask about the second death. On the injection, Gary says that the purpose of the injection is to prepare one's body for the unspeakable. Or in other words, as we imagined, it's to prepare the body for the second death and for possession. When asking Gary about who Gary is, after jokingly saying he's a normal human being just like you and me, he clarifies that he is here to prepare the way for the Antichrist, and he's to give the second death as many times as possible. Now, of course, the Antichrist is a figure in Christianity that brings about revelation, or it brings about the events of Revelation, Judgment Day, Doomsday, whatever you want to call it. This has been hinted at several times. As I mentioned earlier, when you boot up the game, a verse from the book of Revelations is shown on screen. So Gary is here to make way for all of that, and as mentioned, perform the second death ritual as much as possible. And another one of the questions we can ask him is, what exactly is the second death ritual? If you've stuck around this long and you're like, oh, some of these concepts are kind of gross, you probably don't want to hear this. So the second death ritual, and this is the thing that I said at the beginning of the video, is one of the most brutal things I have ever heard in any horror ever. And ever since I played this game, this is probably the detail that's stuck with me the most. Erdorf even said that when he pitched this idea to a room full of people at New Blood, they asked what was wrong with him. And I'm so impressed with it because there's definitely something wrong with him. So what the second death ritual is Gary, or whoever is holding the ritual, puts the mask on someone and carves out their face with a knife, which we've discussed that, well-established ground. But then, so you have to carve out enough that it's kind of deep, you know, that there's like a hole, right? And then you take a living baby, an infant, a newborn, and you pass it through the hole. And you just keep doing that until something comes out the other side. For one of the coolest ideas in body horror I've ever heard. The idea that if this ritual's performed, what would normally just be, you know, gray matter, your face, becomes like a pit, a never-ending pit that you can reach down into. Like the idea of reaching past the head and all that, and then something being brought up out of it. Very cool, very creepy. At the same time, Erdorf, what? Is everything okay at home, man? Do you need to talk about, look, you got my number, we'll talk. I hope you're all right. But no, really, the second death is terrifying. I love it and hate it at the same time. Also, between every question that you ask Gary, his face will become more deformed and messed up. But given the gravity of these questions, you're probably not even noticing that. The whole figuring out what the second death does recontextualizes a lot of stuff we saw earlier, especially in Chapter 3. Like, why would Gary own a baby clinic? I don't know, maybe because he needs a lot of babies? Why were all of those babies crawling around in the basement? Take a guess. Why earlier did I say they weren't really performing a lot of pregnancy terminations at the clinic? Because you need them to be very alive, I imagine, for this to work. Also, remember the thing about Tiffany? How she got overzealous and did the ritual herself with 490 souls? Isn't that just a cheery thought? Where do you even get that many? Like, if you had some kind of like you know, I don't want to get into the details of it. Oh, it's so awful everywhere you look at it, which is great. Horror is supposed to horrify you. Terror is supposed to be terrible. That's the whole point. I get it. But, man. We can ask about the demon Malthus, which, as imagined, he is just another preparation for the Antichrist. And again, Alu was brought into the world by Tiffany against the cult's order, so he doesn't really count in the whole prophecy thing. We can ask about Amy, and Amy, as you've probably put together at this point, was a vessel for the second death. Gary clarifying that she'll be back. It also recontextualizes how horrible John leaving Amy to the cult really is. Because, due to his leaving her, she underwent the second death, and this entire ritual process was used on her. And then finally, we can ask about Nate and Jason. And as you've probably put together at this point,
I suppose you wish they were you, just like you and Mrs. Martin. That is how I know you would come to me.
Nate and Jason aren't real. They were never seen in the Martin household in any of the flashbacks or the paintings on the wall of Amy and her parents. And in John's flashback, whenever we try to go into the twins' room, he says he can't remember that part. Nate and Jason are not real. They are a projection of John's mind regarding him and Lisa, the two real twins of this story. All of the brief flashes of the twins that we saw was just either the demons playing trick on John or his mind playing a trick on himself. Now, how did Garcia know about the twins? I believe John probably told Garcia about them. After John and Garcia began communicating with each other, it's likely that John informed him, while we've lost Amy, the twins want the two boys, Nate and Jason. To clarify, John fully believed that the twins are real. It wasn't until this conversation with Gary he figured out they weren't. So John tells Garcia we need to be on the lookout for the twins, and this also explains why Garcia was never able to find them. He checked the foster care system, he checked parent records, he checked kindergartens, daycares, what have you, and they never came up. Because again, the twins weren't real. The only evidence we have of the twins existing in this entire story is the letters that Cindy Martin wrote to Bob. Other than that, they're not brought up anywhere. And if you're wondering why Cindy Martin wrote about twins that didn't exist, we will figure that out when we talk about our alternate endings. Because it's fate, of course, Chapter 3 has alternate endings. After finishing our questions, Gary says that while this has been fun, he has a rapture to bring about, and that now, John will fulfill his role as being a vessel for the second death. The thing he's been primed to do for decades at this point. This boss fight, which is effectively the final fight if you didn't do the side quests throughout Chapter 3, is against Gary, as Gary uses pretty much every boss move from the entire game. He will teleport, he'll move around, he'll move at you fast, he'll throw a spear. There's this one attack he does called Rain of Spiders, which, oh my gosh. So the way the attack works is Gary says Rain of Spiders, and then like the spider things, you know, the things that John would transform in like Chapter 2, that like gray form he would turn into, a bunch of those spawn and just start raining across the screen, and if any of them touch you, you get knocked down. This move has been heavily nerfed in updates since I played the game. Effectively, he calls it in less and the spiders are less intense, because when I played it, Gary could like call Rain of Spiders 3 times in a row and you were just going to die. Like they would cover up so much of the screen, there was effectively no hope. This is also the second boss fight where you don't immediately die after taking contact with the enemy. Third, if you count the babies in the clinic, but I don't count the babies piling up on you as contact. Okay, if you want to count the babies, this is the third time that happens. Because in the Gary boss fight, if you're hit once, you will drop the cross on the ground and you have to crawl to pick it up before Gary gets to you. If Gary gets to you, we're given a short cutscene of John after receiving the second death, implying that he's been fully killed by the cult, and therefore the rapture, doomsday, what have you, is ready to bring about. But if you get through Gary's stages, if you deal with the Rain of Spiders, this cutscene will play out.
Please. Don't be afraid, kid. I'm Father Garcia. It's good to finally meet you, hijo.
Father Garcia is the GOAT. This man said, hey, you know, you, the demon, may not care about buckshot, but that flesh bag you're in certainly does. Just the rotoscope of the priest pumping the shotgun is one of the hardest things I've seen in games in a long, long time. In this moment, Garcia, and please take a moment to appreciate it, it's so cool. But in this moment, Garcia tells John that it's nice to finally meet him, again implying that the two have never met in person, they've just communicated through letters. John follows Garcia into the next room, and here we see the altar that we have been removing the seal from throughout each of the 3 days. If you didn't do those previous steps, or didn't do all 3 of them, when you get to this final room, there will be a seal, and John and Garcia will be unable to stop Gary. But because we did what we're supposed to, and we removed all 3 seals, now we have full access to the pit that Gary has jumped into. Garcia tells us to go, to stop Gary, that he'll hold off the demons. And with that, John dives into the pit to finally put an end to Gary Miller. And with that, as we make it to the true end game, we have done all the steps for chapter 3. We don't have to just end the game at that fight with Gary we just had. We can now finally fight Gary as the main final boss. We can end the game. But at that time, I want to talk about some of the things that have led up to this moment. For one, I want to talk about the other 2 alternate endings you can get, because the one we're about to talk about is by far the best one and the one that makes sense for the story's arc as a whole. But I also want to talk about what's happening in this moment. Garcia and John going to face down the forces of hell, and John diving into that pit. But before I talk about that, let's talk about the alternate endings. For one, there is the really bad ending, where you don't do anything at all. Straight up, so after each day, if you go get in the car and then drive to the location, you have the option to just get back in your car and go home. Like, you're not even doing the normal progression through each of the days. You're skipping even walking into the clinic or walking into the apartments. If you skip at least the last day, this is what happens on the day of the profane Sabbath. Or, suddenly, this giant caterpillars as John has to evade it and make his way back to this thing. John makes his way back. They make his way back in a similar state of damnation. Next to in a pile of file cabinets is another note. 3 chapters we've played, he's been given a second chance. But here in this ending, he refuses it. He doesn't try again. He gets in his car and goes home. And because of that, not only does John die, but his memory is a profanity. But of course, this isn't the John Ward we know. The John Ward we know went to the clinic, went to the apartments, and went to the daycare. If the player does not do the side quest to defeat the other members of the Unholy Trinity, then when they get to the Crucible, the Unholy Trinity's seal will be over the door, meaning that John and Garcia cannot step into it. With this ending, John and Garcia hold back the demons for some time until Garcia can drop the Crucible onto the doorway. In this ending, Garcia clarifies that they have not defeated Gary, they've just kept him at bay for some time. Father Garcia says that the unspeakable and Gary is still out there, and that the world and Garcia need men like John now more than ever. John says that a year ago, when he was at the Martin household, he was tricked by the devil. Again, this lines up with the interpretation of the being of light being Satan himself. And John says he doesn't know if his faith can be restored, if he'll ever be powerful enough to stop these forces of evil. Depending on the player's actions, Garcia either tells John that he wants to be John's mentor and he can teach him to grow in the faith, or Garcia points his shotgun at John and says John doesn't have a lot of options. Again, here, John exhibits some kind of bravery, but yet he doesn't have the full faith, or doesn't know that he has the full faith, to do what needs to be done. But of course, that still isn't our ending. In our ending, John is standing there before the door of the Crucible, and he jumps in. Now, think about everything that's led John to this moment. All the way back in the 1930s, Miriam Bell caused some kind of satanic something or other to kill 6 kids. She later comes back as the leader of this orphanage at the same church and kills another 4. The sole survivors of this are John and Lisa. Something horrible happens to John and Lisa. It seems that the 2 of them were poised even then to become a victim of the cult one day, groomed into this place of being a vessel for demons coming out of hell. We know that Lisa was going to be one because Tiffany blocked off her door so that Gary couldn't use her for one. And John, as seen what happens if you lose in the boss fight against Gary earlier, would also become one if the cult had their way. So for years, John has been nothing more but cannon fodder for the end times. And he has done everything in his power to stop him. He became a priest, he went out on exorcisms, and what did he end up doing on his very first exorcism, as he told Father Alred? He got an entire family killed, he got the other priest killed, and he got kicked out of the ministry. Because again, after making a deal with the devil that the devil could have Amy's soul, he ran into the arms of the police. A police force that, of course, didn't believe him, so they throw him in a psych ward. While there, from the records we've seen, he was tormented. He knew Amy was in there, he knew that her possession was his fault, and of course he was eventually exonerated for the murders as, DNA evidence or research would prove that he was innocent, but he was still thought to be crazed. In a letter that John writes to the hospital, it is in a tone and cadence that explicitly does not sound like John. As a matter of fact, it sounds a lot like Gary. I believe that even while John was in the institution, they needed to use John for the second death ritual. So, Gary wrote the letter to get him out, and probably pulled some political strings as well. So then John is let out of the psych ward only to eventually be meat for this cult to use. But during that time, he tries to find peace. He's now out of the ministry, he's no longer a priest, he's renounced by the Vatican. So now that his vows no longer matter, he falls in love, and marries a woman named Molly. And maybe for a few months, everything was okay, until he began to have these dreams about Amy. He could not get over the fact that he condemned this girl to damnation because of his own cowardice. So he leaves Molly, he tells her that he has to do this, he writes that letter exclaiming that regardless of what I told you, I'm not crazy, I know what I saw. And he leaves. We see that Molly leaves him because of this. I mean, who could blame her? And then after all of the events we've seen through chapter 1, chapter Chapter 2, Chapter 3. Here John is again in front of the crucible. The man who ran away now staring down the gun barrel of hell, and he jumps in. I posed the question earlier, where is God in this story? Because the existence of demons inherently implies the existence of God, right? And the only depiction of God that we had was Satan in disguise. So what is the Almighty's influence? What does he have to say about all of this? And one of the details I love about Faith so much, and it actually gave me the idea before I even talked to Erdorf, that the creator has to be a believer. Because, just as seen in the game and just as seen in life, God does not fix people's problems by taking their problems from them. Instead, he makes them strong enough to take their problems on their own. This is seen time and time again throughout Bible stories, especially out of characters who otherwise are undeserving of the grace they receive. Characters like David, who had an affair and then murdered the woman's husband, was called the man after God's own heart before and after that event. Paul, the father of missions, to many the greatest Christian who ever lived, spent the first half of his life hunting down people and massacring pastors and selling women into slavery. While John Ward had stepped very far away from any path of redemption or any path of light, he has now been given the means to come back. I mean, think about the events of chapter 2 that we saw. He has a dream by coincidence that tells him everything he needs to know about where this cult came from, how Miriam Bell and what his own connection to it is. He is given the contact of Father Garcia, and supposedly Garcia is also given dreams of John, so the two of them meet over these visions or by chance dreams that they're having in their sleep. And not to mention that every single demon, no matter how big or how strong that John has come across, is able to be defeated by just the little picture of a cross. The influence of God in this story is the entire story. Every step of the way, John has had that cross there to fight his battles. And while, yes, it is the cross that is defeating the demons, it's John who's holding it. The John Ward we saw at the beginning of this story and the John Ward we see now are two very different people. So here on the precipice of damnation, this Father Ward jumps into hell. We find ourselves, where else, but back at the Martin household. The Martin household is covered in notes everywhere. The majority of them simply read,
Gary loves you. Gary is a normal human being, just like you and me.
again reaffirming the cult statements over and over. But there's one note at the bottom of the staircase that connects all the dots and makes this entire story make sense.
March 18th, 1934. Miriam is ready. We will perform the ritual according to her instructions tonight. March the 19th, 1934. We successfully gave the second death to Miriam. We have been passing living newborns through the newly made portal as quickly as we can get them. So far, there has been no response from the other side. March the 23rd, 1934. After several days of sacrifices, we finally got a response. A tiny hand reached out from the portal. We took the hand and pulled out a baby boy. It appears to be a normal human baby, just like you and me. We named it Gary.
And now it all makes sense. Why did Miriam begin this cult and for some reason Gary now runs it? Because Gary was the point of the entire cult in the first place. Gary is not a human and is instead the demon Astaroth. In several sort of extracurricular beliefs around things like Christianity or Judaism, Astaroth is believed to be one of the chief princes of hell, sometimes even being called part of the demonic trinity between Lucifer, Beelzebub, and Astaroth. One of the most powerful demons, and as Gary mentioned earlier in the story, here to bring about the Antichrist. So Miriam, so wicked and evil all the way back then, had the second death performed on her, and the demon that came out of her face was Gary Miller, which is why Gary refers to her as his mother. And all these years later, Gary has planned to bring about the Antichrist by using the same technique on John, Amy, and whoever else he can. But not if John has something to say about it. We make our way up to the attic to see it is now a sort of altar. Hanging at the back of the altar is the body of Miriam Bell. And in front of Miriam is Gary, now in his true form, the demon Astaroth. Gary informs us that the original plan for all of this was Malthus and Gary would join inside of the vessel of Miriam. However, her form was too old and broken, so the two of them had to pick a new vessel to possess. This vessel was to be the young Amy Martin. John's gotten in the way of that plan. Astaroth says it doesn't matter, that he will bring about the profane Sabbath anyway. He just has to get rid of John first. But before he does, he lets him in on a little secret.
Before I go, I will let you in on the secret. Gary does not play.
The boss fight begins, and again, I know this has been nerfed now, but this was at one point one of the hardest things I've ever done in a game ever. Gary will randomly charge at you from around the ring. He will set traps in the way so that you can't move. He'll also randomly dart from one side of the wall to the other. Avoiding all of these moves, eventually we will get Gary through his first phase, which means everything gets worse because now Malthus will join in on the fight and fire arrows from either side of the screen. And once again, if we're hit by anything, we're dead. On the bright side though, dealing damage to one of them deals damage to both of them, so you can hit Malthus or Gary to cause a lot of hit points really fast. Eventually, after some time and probably a lot of Mortis, it will seem that the two will be defeated, as they will begin to fade away and to join what's left of them inside the body of Miriam Bell. And the screen gives you a congratulations, you've done it, you beat the entire game. Only of course you haven't, because then the amalgamation of Malthus, Gary, and Sister Bell appear. This entire part of the fight is effectively a bullet hell. Miriam will cause these skulls to fly at you, to blow up and make more skulls. She'll shoot arrows down at you from the top of the screen. There will be these rings of fire that appear, all of which you have to dodge while trying to deal as much damage to Miriam as possible. And if all of this seems impossible, it normally would be if it wasn't for the fact that now John can take a lot of damage. See, now John is renewed, he's become a different man. And every time that he gets hit during this fight, he says a word of prayer to God. John can take a total of 10 hits before he's dead, as he ends with faith without works is ... If he gets hit one more time, then he dies, which is mortis, or death. But John's become much stronger. He's much different than the man who began this battle against Gary so many years ago. Eventually, after dealing enough damage to Miriam, for a brief second, Malphas and Gary will split off from her, leaving her exposed. Now during this stage, the cross won't do anything. It seems that perhaps she's unstoppable. But remember that note we found at the bottom of the statue in Garyland? The one that said, and I'll read it again, the bottom go. Eventually, after dealing enough damage to Miriam, for a brief second, Malphas and Gary will split off from her, leaving her exposed. Now during this stage, the cross won't do anything. It seems that perhaps she's unstoppable. But remember that note we found at the bottom of the statue in Garyland? The one that said, and I'll read it again, the body of the mother stayeth suspended beneath the crucible of the profane Sabbath. That's Miriam, that's where we're at right now. If thou canst unlock the final secret of the crucible, know ye this. The cross hath the power to weaken the mother, but only someone who is ablaze with purifying fire can truly destroy her. If thou canst understand these words, thou shalt know the true cost of thy faith. This note, whoever left it, whatever left us, was giving us a hint as to how to defeat Miriam. And at the bottom of the stages are 2 torches. So, just like John does in the alternate ending to the prologue of chapter 2, he runs to the fire and sets himself ablaze before jumping into Miriam. And this move causes her form to explode. In the explosion, Malphas disappears. No form for him to inhabit. He's now banished back to hell. John himself is covered in blood and sinew. And then as he stands there with Gary, Amy floats down in front of them. Gary tries to enact the ritual to take over her form for the profane Sabbath, but Gary has failed. The vessel doesn't work, there weren't enough spirits, the Antichrist cannot come. Hell will not win today, and it's Gary's fault. So, as Gary approaches Amy, a hand reaches out of hell and brings him back in, punished to the damnation he could not bring forth. And now that the profane Sabbath is ended, that the second death has passed, and that ultimately the cult's actions have meant nothing, punished to the damnation he could not bring forth. And now that the profane Sabbath is ended, that the second death has passed, and that ultimately the cult's actions have meant nothing, Amy's soul returns for just a moment. And her and John share this.
Amy, I'm so sorry. I couldn't save you. En nomine Patri et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen.
The cross in his hand, once again, upright gold. With Amy at rest and the cult destroyed, Garcia and John make their way out of the daycare. We see that there was a bloodbath outside. It seems that the cult, in an act of desperation, knowing that they had lost, had attacked the police and the police fought back, leaving no survivors. John and Garcia begins to talk. While Garcia says that they have defeated a powerful evil, the unspeakable is still out there, and he still needs to be destroyed. In this ending, Garcia tells John that he's become much stronger. He's a much powerful warrior of faith, and that Garcia needs men like him. As they're talking, Lisa shows up. Lisa tells him that this can all be over, that the two of them can go together and leave this life behind, and maybe for the first time, start a life anew. The overbearing presence of Miriam Bell and everything the cult has done to them is now gone. They can simply walk away from this. And from here, the player gets the choice if he goes with Lisa or Garcia. If the player goes with Lisa, the two of them join hands, and it's implied that John and Lisa set out to start a life of peace away from the torment they've known for so long. And if the player goes with Garcia, they also join hands in a very cool dude bro fashion, and it's assumed that the two set out to destroy the unspeakable once and for all. Now, Erdorf has clarified that he doesn't see either option as a bad ending. It's definitely not a bad ending if John decides to set off and live a life with Lisa. I mean, the two have been through so much at this point. How could they not want to set off and be satisfied with leaving this life behind? Especially considering how young they were inducted into this demonic plan. And while I don't think that's a bad option at all, to me, the canon ending is siding with Garcia. Because the journey of these 3 games, or 3 chapters of one game, have been John deciding if he is worthy to fight the evils of this world. And the recognition that while he was cowardly and undeserving of the power of God then, he certainly has become a warrior against evil now. Again, the transformation of the cross from gold to silver to bronze, but then back to gold. In my mind, Garcia and John set out to defeat the unspeakable and the forces of evil by whatever means God will allow.
Let's go fight some demons.
The game ending with the 2 of them driving off in a vehicle as the credits roll. And think about how far we've come. This young orphan boy, an orphan boy who watched his mother Meredith die, something that he was so afraid of, a demon would one day taunt him about it in the Martin house. And then this boy who is thrown into centuries and millennia of demonic planning for the end times for the rapture. And he was always meant to be nothing more than a vessel for it. But in spite of that, he became a warrior. This orphan grew up to save his sister, to save Garcia, to defeat the forces of evil in all of their forms, from Astaroth to Alu and everyone else who stepped in his way. And he did it, of course, through the power of God, but God gave him the power to do it himself. This child who became a priest was able to defeat the devil, to sign his soul over to him, and then defeat him once more. All of that was done by Father John Ward. And all that it took was a little bit of... So if it wasn't apparent enough, I'm a huge fan of this game, and you should be too. Not only do I think it's, a great example of horror, a great example of story writing, but it's a lot of fun. The art direction, the design, the rotoscoping, it drips with passion in every way. And it's something that I definitely think more people should be attuned to. This game's got a lot of attention. It got nominated for a lot of game awards. I think critics are tuned in to how good it is. But I'd love to see more general audiences catch on to it as well. Again, it's a unique style, but one that I believe deserves to be looked at. So that's why I made this video. But really, check them out. Check out the game. I'll link it somewhere down in the description. Go follow Erdorf on Twitter. And then if you've heard all this now and you want to hear our interview where we talk for hours about this game and his inspiration and him as a writer, and there was a lot we talked about in the interview as far as story beats and symbolism and stuff like that in the game that I didn't even cover here. So if this was interesting to you, go check out all of that for sure. But I believe, I'm trying to think if there's anything else I need to plug. Go check out the second channel if you're interested in my
bird traveling the desert. This one felt really obvious because each time I respawned at the Odyssey, it'd be close by. This ended up being a bit harder than you'd think, but it did give me a good chance to learn more about the capture. I don't know the specifics, but it became pretty apparent that the more I boosted, the less time I had before Bonsai Bill would explode. This meant to get the moon, I had to balance boosting so I didn't explode too early, but also still made it far enough to catch the bird. Nailing the trick perfectly took some time, and I had a lot of close calls. Come on. Gosh dang it. But eventually, I managed to get it. Come on. No. Yes! Oh my god, it pushed me up the ledge. I don't know if that mattered. All right, that is our first moon in Sand Kingdom. I decided to follow that moon up with overlooking the desert town, which I thought would be difficult because Bonsai Bill is massive, but surprisingly you can just barely poke your nose in at the moon and collect literal frames before exploding. After respawning back at the Odyssey, I flew toward the ruins where, to my surprise, I could hit the checkpoint. This was really useful because having places I can respawn on a capture that has a limited lifespan could make moons that are too far from the Odyssey possible. Because of this, I immediately went for the Moai habitat checkpoint, which I could just barely hit, giving me a potential third starting location to hunt for more moons. I warped back to the ruins where I decided to test the waters and the sheep. Like, sure, this probably won't be a solo moon, but it was impressive that I could at least get one into the pin. Back at the ruins, I used a mound of sand to get high enough and grab a leaning pillar. As I exploded, I started to wonder if there was a slope that could reach the Jaxi Ruins checkpoint, which could lead to even more moons. I tried gaining height using the hills by the oasis, but that took too long. I didn't want to give up on the idea and decided if I started at the Odyssey, I might get a better line and have more time to reach the checkpoint. And I was right. Let's go! This put me in the perfect position to respawn and collect the lone pillar moon, as well as gave me access to another checkpoint inside the ruins. I also tried using it to get the archway moon, but because the checkpoint itself wasn't high enough, I had to turn around, gain a little height on another dune, and rush back towards the moon. There we go! Okay. I was very shocked at Bonsai Bill's success as a solo capture. Like, it probably won't do as well in other kingdoms, but it's actually insane how much the Dunes of Sand Kingdom enabled this guy. However, I was very clearly reaching the end of what was possible alone. I was still able to collect inside a block because Bonsai Bill can break certain rocks without exploding, as well as the Secret of Jaxi Ruins because this trait can also apply to chests for some reason. But anyways, that was it. I tried other things like the Oasis notes, but my efforts made it clear I needed to swap to 2-player if I wanted to make more progress. The first thing I did was grab the Tostarena Town checkpoint with Cappy and see if I could push the seed in the pot like I did with Bullet Bill. I tried this a few times, but the seed never budged. This didn't mean the moon would be impossible, just that I needed to use Cappy to hit it. I came up with a strategy where I would fly Bonsai Bill around the right side of the fountain to delay my explosion, while maneuvering Cappy around the left to hit the seed into the pot. Come on! No! This was painfully difficult, but after that attempt, I was certain it'd be possible. About 10 minutes later, I managed to find a strat that let me get the Bullet Bill stuck, which turned all of my prior struggles into a joke. I got the moon shortly after, and remained. That being said, I don't think Charge and Chuck is a capture that should have the same utility that both the Bills have, where it can break stronger objects like the first moon rock, but with the added bonus he doesn't have to die to accomplish it. I am slightly doubting my initial prediction, however. Chuck doesn't have a jump, so if I can't get him anywhere where the utility is actually useful, he probably won't beat Bonsai Bill. But hey, I can't say that for sure until I try. I started my run in Cap Kingdom, where we're back to a good old-fashioned capture that can't climb steps. I moved on to Cascade, where I was slightly concerned there'd be some weird code that prevents Chuck from breaking the first moon rock. Fortunately, this wasn't the case, and it just worked, letting Chuck become the third capture to collect the first moon. Unfortunately, the rest of the kingdom didn't go as smoothly. I can't jump, so passing the bridge to the rest of the level is impossible. Entering into sand, I started with the obvious stuff like the seed moons. Charge and Chuck is actually too small to grab them normally, but if you start charging, his hitbox becomes tall enough to collect them. It's kind of funny that makes the difference, but hey, I'm not complaining about 2 easy moons. I used this knowledge to get the bird as a cut through the oasis, and then followed that up with sheep and hard rock. I thought I was out of moons to get and was ready to head into 2-player until I remembered the cactus moon at the edge of the kingdom. Surprisingly, Charge and Chuck can't break cactuses, making this moon impossible. I finally decided to swap into 2-player, where I wanted to try out some sub areas. Oh, just barely not too big. You can like squeeze through. But yeah, we're not gonna get a moon in here. That much is obvious. How did I make it through that door? What the heck? Is it because it was on a slope? Honestly, this isn't even something I considered when ranking Chuck, but I guess he can only enter some sub-areas, which may affect his final score. Since it didn't seem like I'd be getting any weird 2-player moons, I just collected the 3 ground pound moons in Alcove before leaving the kingdom. Charging Chuck proceeds to make 0 interesting ground in the mid-game, collecting the 2-player moon in Lake, 2 moons in Wooded, and absolutely nothing in Cloud and Metro. Snow Kingdom, on the other hand. Come on! Oh no! He almost fell all the way, but he hasn't yet. Gosh, it's so close. It just gets so steep. Wait, come on. Come on. Come on! No! Oh, I was so close! Wait, I think I can make this one. Let's go! Charging Chuck can do Snowdrift! And he can get the moon with 2-player mode. That's the only moon Charging Chuck would collect in Snow Kingdom, and it's not for the reasons you'd think. Wait, what? Wait, why did he die? What? Huh? Apparently, some captures just randomly die when you try to enter Shiveria. I have no idea why this happens. Like, why can Lakitu enter Shiveria, but Chuck can't? It's strange, but rules are rules, so I left the kingdom. The last moon I managed to collect in the run was the chest moon in Ruined using 2-player. This moon has been a struggle to get for a lot of captures because they just fall straight down with no air control. Fortunately, Chuck's boost gets around this by letting me turn while falling off the edge to reach the platform. This is surprisingly difficult, but it